Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. And my name is Professor Barlo Dermagerdician. I'm a professor of Armenian Studies at California State University in Fresno. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Asya Darbinyan, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, where she offers courses on the history of the Holocaust and on women's experiences during genocide. She earned her doctorate in history from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. And her research and teaching expertise stands at the intersection of Armenian history, the history of the Russian Empire, genocide, refugees, and humanitarian interventions. Before joining the Martin Springer Institute, Dr. Darbinyan was a postdoctoral fellow in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University and the deputy director of the Armenian Genocide Museum-Institute in Yerevan, Armenia. She will be serving as a visiting professor in Armenian Genocide Studies at Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies for the 2022-23 academic year. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Darbinyan to give her presentation on Armenian genocide refugees at the Russo-Turkish border. Dr. Darbinyan.
Thank you, Dr. Dermagerdician, for your generous introduction. And I want to thank the organizers of Genocide Awareness Week for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. And thank you all for coming to this talk. So I will not, without further ado, I will just proceed to my presentation. I will talk today, as Dr. Dermagerdician already mentioned, about Armenian refugees at the Russo-Turkish border. And actually, Barlo's yesterday's presentation was quite helpful in terms of laying ground for like the general history of Armenian genocide and Armenian genocide field. I'm grateful for that, especially because he mentioned how important recent studies are on different aspects of Armenian genocide, studies that do not just intend to prove the fact of Armenian genocide, but try to understand nuances of population movements, of refugees, of humanitarian aspect of it, of regional studies, and so on. And also, it was important that he brought together past and present by mentioning current crisis happening in the region. And I would also like to start my presentation by bringing up those certain connections and parallels. So the 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Russian brokered ceasefire agreement signed in November 2020, Turkish support to Azerbaijan, the deployment of Russian peacekeeping forces, and the mass exodus of tens of thousands of refugees to Armenia have raised a number of questions. What political, economic, and strategic interests do the world powers have in South Caucasus? What role did the two regional powers, Russia and Turkey, play in escalation or de-escalation of that conflict? And how can we understand the historical context of these complex and multi-layered relationships among the states and the peoples of the region? While in November 2020, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan hosted a victory parade in Baku in presence of a special guest, President Erdogan of Turkey, the Armenian refugees evacuating their villages in miles-long columns of cars and trucks lamented, and I quote, "Why has Putin abandoned us?" End quote. This was not the first time that Armenians felt like the Russian state had abandoned them. Over 100 years ago, Ottoman and Russian troops fought at the Caucasus battlefront of the First World War. The border between the two empires kept shifting dependent on the military developments. And when in summer 1915, the Russian troops retreated from Mush, Bitlis, Van, these areas that they had occupied earlier, the Armenian residents of those regions felt that they had been deceived by Russians. Like in November 2020, the geopolitical interests of world and regional powers clashed with the humanitarian concerns and sentiments for the people experiencing those crises. My work, my research explores the Russian Empire's responses to humanitarian emergency at the Caucasus Front, which is this line right here, in this whole area of the First World War. It analyzes the efforts of Imperial Russian authorities and local national organizations on behalf of those hundreds of thousands of men, women, children that lost their loved ones and fled their homes, particularly between 1914 and 1917. Most importantly, it sheds new light on the experiences and perspectives of the refugees that played the significant role in struggle for survival. In my talk today, I reflect on key questions about Russian imperial humanitarianism during this period and on how Armenian refugees perceived Russian policies in the region. Now we're looking at the map of the Armenian genocide that shows the main killing sites, deportation routes. Another version of this map we already saw yesterday during Barlow's presentation. And the genocide was carried out stage by stage. First, Ottomans aimed to deprive the Armenians of leadership and of their will or ability to unite and resist. And then the Ottoman Turkish government focused on destruction of Armenian communities throughout the empire through massacres, deportations, abductions, forced assimilation. The genocidal methods varied from place to place. For instance, Armenians of the Black Sea port city Trabzon, about 15,000 Armenians, were deported. So we're talking about this area. But many were arrested, taken by ship out to sea and drowned, which you may notice from these strange arrows that are actually pointing to nowhere, which is they're pointing to the sea. So we're talking about regional practices of genocide. If from Western provinces, Armenians were deported to the deserts, in Eastern provinces of Ottoman Empire, the scene was different. That's why you see large red circles on the map on the eastern part of this map. Because in most of the Armenians living in these areas, like in Bitlis or in Mush, were killed in their home villages and towns. Very few of them were deported. So let's get back to this zoomed in map, the one that is zooming into that eastern frontier between Ottoman Empire and Russia. And why? Because as a result of the war on the Caucasus Front, hundreds of thousands Armenians were moving back and forth. And that's what actually this map is trying to show, the population movements from this area as Russian and Turkish troops were dependent on military developments moving back and forth. About 200,000 refugees from Ottoman Empire reached the Caucasus in July, August 1915 because of these military developments, but also of the genocide orchestrated and systematically implemented by Ottoman state against its Armenian subjects. These refugees walked over 120 miles in deserted mountainous regions, and many died from starvation, diseases, from exhaustion. Even when they reached Transcaucasia, they were accommodated in Yerevan, Yelizavetpol, Tiflis, Gubernias, which is all these areas on the map. Garos Asuni, an Armenian activist and relief worker, witnessed the mass population movements at the Ottoman-Russian border in these regions in summer 1915. He wrote, and I quote, "From now on, the word refugee, Gahtakan, has become a synonym for a Turkish Armenian, a miserable and desperate person," end quote. I also really appreciated when Dr. Waller talked about the complicity of identities. And even though there it was more about perpetrators, here we're talking about the complexity of identity of Armenians and Ottoman Armenians who were somehow defined within this category and refugee, and what it was seen by the contemporaries. And as we know, it hasn't really changed nowadays in terms of seeing refugees as this faceless groups with no individuality, identity. It's just this miserable and desperate people needing help. It was similarly described 100 years ago. Garos Asuni also drew this map trying to show the directions in which groups of Armenians were moving from Erzurum, from Mush, from Van into the Caucasus. It's an Armenian language map, but I think it's interesting how he has managed to highlight those directions in which Armenians were moving. And you know, the reports about these population movements, about the crisis in the Caucasus, immediately, of course, reached Russian authorities. And Russian political and public figures, they protested against Ottoman violence, and they pressed for relief work in order to confront this emergency. A number of committees and organizations, both Russian and Armenian, engaged in Armenian relief, operating in the Caucasus region, but also in Russia's interior and also in those temporarily occupied territories of Eastern Ottoman Empire. Among the Russian organizations were All-Russian Union of Towns, which was centered in Moscow, or the Tatyana Committee, which was named after Tsar's daughter Tatyana Nikolaevna. But there were also Armenian national organizations, such as Moscow Armenian Committee or Echmiadzin Committee for Brotherly Aid. Why am I mentioning all these organizations and the responses? Well, because we see that both Russian imperial government as well as a number of organizations provided assistance to these thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that were crossing the border and making it to the Caucasus. Yet there are a number of questions that remain unanswered about this period and about the policies and practices of Russian Empire towards these refugees in the region. One of those questions is, was this substantial relief effort on behalf of Armenians humanitarianism? Reflecting on Russia's imperial policies and its fluctuating attitudes towards Armenians, Ron Suni wrote, and I quote, "As Europe moved toward World War I, the image of Russia as a potential savior of Armenians was dimmed and tarnished. Across the Arax River, Ottoman Armenians looked warily at the Russian state. Was it a potential savior or simply another unpredictable imperial master?" End quote. This raised question implied that the imperial master was unlikely to be a savior at the same time. In modern literature, history, social sciences, the term empire, imperialism are widely perceived as negative concepts. In one historian's words, and I quote, "To the 21st century mind, empire sins against both democracy and modernity. It is both wicked and redundant," end quote. Hence, although the assistance to Armenian refugees during the war and genocide saved thousands of lives, there has been a dispute about Russian motivation for assisting Armenians or for humanitarian action, if any. some scholars, especially from Armenia, Avetis Hartunyan, Manok Samakyan, have labeled these policies as imperialistic, merely directed to solve urgent military concerns of Caucasus army. Because this was the time when number one concern of Russian Empire was the war against Ottoman Empire. Hartunyan does not use term humanitarian or humanitarianism, humanitarian assistance at all to describe any of the efforts for Armenian refugees. One might argue in support of this approach because contemporaries also were not really using the term humanitarianism. But the problem with that approach, however, is that it's not really based on analysis of intricacies of relief work or based on analysis of what refugees said about that assistance. And it's more about portraying Russia as this one unitary entity that was pursuing some cynical policies towards Armenians. And although Russian Empire's population provided tremendous assistance, support to Ottoman Armenians, Hartunyan believes that Tsarist authorities never actually aimed at helping Armenians. And whatever they did was just byproduct of Russian colonization plans, imperialistic plans. And feel free to ask me about what colonization plans I'm talking about in the Q&A. I would love to talk about that. But as Canadian academic and former politician Michael Ignatieff holds, humanitarian action is not unmasked if it is shown to be the instrument of imperial power. Motives are not discredited just because they are shown to be mixed. Looking into varying agendas, concerns of local, national, international charity and state actors and agencies, my research measures what specifically made some of them humanitarian and the others less so. And the culture of giving in Russian Empire was there long before the First World War. But what we see if we look into these policies during World War I is that this was not just a traditional Russian benevolence or almsgiving. It was different in scope and scale. The activists, the professionals were focusing on long-term assistance, on training and education of refugees. So based on some of those files and material that I could find in archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, in Yerevan, or in Tbilisi, in my work, I tried to change the narrative prevalent in Armenian historiography, according to which the Russian anti-Armenian policies during the war were merely directed to colonize and rule Armenia without Armenians. And instead, I used the term imperial humanitarianism to describe Russia's responses to this crisis. I argue that these responses, they were determined by confluence of three elements. Humanitarian sentiment was there, but also imperial colonization agendas, and of course, war contingencies. I also emphasize that Russian Empire as a complex structure did not decide its policies by centering them around Armenians or any other group. And policies towards Armenians were not that different from policies towards or sometimes against other ethnic and religious groups in the empire. Yet, the question that Suni was asking, I think, deserves more scrutiny, especially when we think about refugees' perceptions of these policies towards survivors, those who escaped the genocide and made it all the way to Russian Empire. What was the vision of Armenian refugees regarding Russian Empire's approach to Russian policies in Caucasus? Did they see Tsar and his army as protector of Armenians during this period? Was Russian treatment of Armenian genocide survivors and the refugees seen as humanitarian act? And I do this by looking into Armenian language sources, and Barlo touched upon this yesterday as well, Because unfortunately, for many years, Armenian Genocide Studies has focused on looking into foreign sources to study the whole topic, on archival documents coming from the West or Turkish archival documents, on missionary reports, and somehow the Armenian language sources, and particularly the testimonies, accounts, and memoirs of Armenians, those who actually went through that experience, were neglected. And again, I would be happy to talk about that more, to the question of why. But when we look into testimonies of refugees that made it to Transcaucasia or the Caucasus, we see their varying experiences during these population movements and their quite nuanced understanding of Turkish and Kurdish attacks on the way, of Russian victories and retreats, of migration, flight, assistance. And in this presentation, I will use two sources for refugee testimonies. One collected by Armenian activists in 1916 in Transcaucasia, called Vshtapatum, and the other collected by Armenian poet Vahan Teryan in winter 1915-16 in an orphanage school in Yerevan. In 1916, a group of Armenian activists who called themselves chroniclers planned and conducted interviews about the massacres in eastern provinces of Ottoman Empire with refugees who had made it to the Caucasus. This collection of testimonies based on the interviews was called Vshtapatum, which means narratives of sorrow. In their testimonies, refugees focused on the massacres, on the lives that were lost during this crisis, also on property losses. After all, they had to leave everything and escape to a different country. The testimonies also provided significant details about their experiences during this exile or exodus from their homes, and about Turkish and Kurdish attacks on the way. Why these testimonies particularly, why are they important? Well, one of the reasons is that they are collected in 1916. Genocide is still unfolding. So the refugees remembered their experiences in detail. They then remember names of the relatives that were lost during the killings. They remember names and or occupations of Turkish and Kurdish perpetrators that were involved in these attacks. Sometimes they also remember the names of the Kurdish neighbors that helped them, hid them, due to which they eventually escaped and survived. Thus, as one historian puts it, these refugees testified in their dual capacity as victims and witnesses. The collection of children's survivors, the second one that I mentioned, and this is actually a group from those children in the orphanage with whom poet Vahan Teryan worked and collected their stories. They were collected in winter of 1915-16, and these were the children that had survived by escaping from Van, but many of them were parentless. So they were put into this orphanage and they were taught some courses. Many of them were taught by refugee teachers from those areas that were being attacked. And Vahan Teryan, this poet, he wanted to be involved in somehow in helping. But unlike some others who were actually providing the assistance in terms of medical assistance and so on, he decided to collect their stories. So he went to the school and asked the students to write down their stories about this exodus from their home. And there were no specific interview questions. They were allowed to tell whatever they wanted. And the poet did not change anything. He just recorded that, collected them in a notebook. The only thing that the children were instructed was to put their name and age on the bottom of the page after writing their story. They were from 10 to 15 years old. And another interesting thing about this collection is that it was discovered only just a couple of years ago. No one knew about it because after the poet had collected it, he hadn't really, he died actually very young. So he hadn't managed to do anything with it. And this notebook was kept in a museum in Armenia, Charin's Museum of Literature and Art. And only recently, the poet's great-grandson found it and published it. And one of the reasons they hadn't noticed what was inside was because the notebook was titled Vahan Teryan's Student Notebook. So no one had actually opened to look into like what was included in that notebook. And it turned out those were like firsthand testimonies of exile from home during genocide. What is another importance about these testimonies, both the first one with more adult refugees and the second one of children's stories, is that it also shows the high level of self-organization among Armenians while the massacres, the genocide were unfolding, because these activists not only understood the importance of saving refugees physically, but they also realized the significance of saving their stories. Some of the stories included stories of refugees who survived because of they were hidden or sheltered by their Kurdish neighbors or local aghas, which were the Kurdish landlords. And one of the stories was told by Gulizar Bedelyan from Van, Katratskar village. And I'm going to be naming every single refugee or survivor whose story I'm quoting from, because they believed that it was important that their names were remembered. And I think also they, in this way, we change this view of the refugees seen as faceless and nameless group, because all of them were individuals, human beings who deserve to be remembered. So Gulizar Bedelyan recalled that Murad Agha, the Kurdish landlord of their village, opened his doors for the terrified women and children and hosted everyone in his house. And it was about 200 women and children. And when the Russians approached their village, this terrified Kurdish Agha appealed to the women he had taken in, and as Gulizar remembered, told them, and I quote, "For 2 weeks I have been protecting you from the Kurds. Now you should protect me so that the Russians do not kill me," end quote. This account talks to an important aspect of complexity of motives, right? It shows what influenced certain groups or individuals' actions, in this case, Kurdish neighbors or aghas, towards local Armenians during the war and refugee crisis. For instance, Kurds in Dersim region reportedly helped Armenians in the area, sometimes providing them with food, also shelter during the atrocities. As one contemporary newspaper recounted in July 1916, the local Kurds, surrendered over 1,500 Armenian children and women to the Russian troops. This reaction to Russian troops' advance in Eastern Ottoman regions and their successful military operations against Turkish forces was quite common. Kurdish locals would deliver groups of Armenian women and children to Russian troops, boasting about how they saved Armenians' lives, and hence that they should not be punished or considered enemies. The same survivor testimonies also demonstrate how many of those Kurdish landlords or just the neighbors either attacked Armenian men during the massacres or informed the perpetrators, the Turkish soldiers, of their whereabouts. Even after providing shelter to remnants of those Armenian families under their roof, these Kurdish aghas continued looting the villages and appropriating the Armenian possessions and properties. Describing the developments in their village of Soskum in early April 1915, Mariam Petrosyan called all those Armenians hiding in Agha's house, including herself, prisoners. as they stayed there for 3 weeks with no right to leave the place and enter their own houses. She also emphasized that the entire wealth of the village was, and I quote, distributed among the Kurds by those aghas. And when the Russian forces entered their villages, the agha told to these prisoner women, I quote, "Here, your uncle and your men came. Get lost, go to them," end quote. So this corroborates the argument of those contemporary newspapers that articulated the self-interest behind the repetitive actions of local Kurdish leaders and neighbors to greet Russian troops by announcing the release of thousands of Armenians. This example also shows that the classic division in genocide studies with regards to perpetrators, bystanders, and victims, about which Professor Alvarez also talked yesterday, is quite fluid and blurry, and we cannot really define those groups clearly. Refugee survivors from Bitlis Vilayet recalled cases of surrender of Kurdish perpetrators to Russian forces. So after they would, for example, return some of those women, they would surrender to Russians. They were pardoned despite appeals and complaints of Armenians to punish them, or at least investigate their violent actions. Noyem Noreyan from Goag village was a victim of abduction, and she remembered the name of the Kurdish man who kidnapped and abused her. She was appalled to see him pardoned after surrendering to Russians. I quote, "Considering myself free, I complained to Russians about the Kurd that abducted me, but they did not do anything to him, probably because he had pledged loyalty to them," end quote. Here you see a picture of Armenian girls that were abducted during genocide and later rescued from captivity and reunited with the Armenian community. Many of them, just like Noyem, had gone through tremendous hardships, and some of them were prepared to share and tell their stories. That is why it is so important to pay attention to these sources. Refugees also had really contrasting stories, not only about Kurdish and Turkish perpetrators or these Kurdish neighbors, but also about Russian soldiers and Cossacks' attitudes towards Armenians. Some complained about Russian military's disrespectful, inhumane treatment, and even about cases of outright violence, while others told stories of extraordinary efforts by soldiers to save them. For instance, Sirar P, a 13-year-old girl, wrote in her account that when these Russian troops came into their town, Armenians thought that they were being, and I quote, "liberated from Turkish barbarism and atrocities," end quote. But then when Russians retreated, they felt as if they were deceived. So this is pretty much the same wording as in the 2020 newspaper report. Tigran Safarian from Votenchor village recalled that Russians beat up and violently forced the people to migrate during the Russian retreats, and 2 of the villagers, according to the same account, were even killed by the Cossacks for just being too slow during the retreat. Karo Sasuni, the Ottoman Armenian activist that I previously mentioned, reflected on the feelings of both Ottoman and also Russian Armenians during this period, because Ottoman Armenians were escaping and crossing the border to Russian Empire, and there were already Armenians living in Russian Empire who were the accepting side of the story, and he described their feelings of excitement, confusion, fear. With every Russian retreat and exodus of Armenians, Sasuni witnessed panic and distress. At the same time, with each advance of Russian troops, with each effort by Russian refugees to return, to reconstruct their houses and farms in their homeland, as they called it, of course, Sasuni noticed hope for and trust in a better future among Armenians. Sanam Hovanesyan from Erishter village who managed to escape from Kurdish captivity with her daughter-in-law and was headed towards Russian positions in Mush, recounted, and I quote, "On our way, I saw a Cossack and explained to him our situation and goal. He pitied us and dismounted from the horse. He put my daughter-in-law on the horseback. When I got tired on the way, the Cossack even carried me on his back. This is how we reached Mush," end quote. This story resonates with the cover of this Parisian newspaper, Excelsior, published in June 1916, that carried an illustration of a Russian soldier on a horseback with a refugee child in his arms. Except in Sanam's story, it was not a baby girl, but those were two adult Armenian women who would have been exposed to even more horrors and suffering, if not for the Cossack soldiers' helping hand. And since I brought up parallels between stories, I also would like to bring to your attention another more recent image. The statue of a peacekeeper was unveiled on November 10 of 2021 in the premises of a Russian military camp in the vicinity of Stepanakert, capital of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. In honor of, and I quote here, the first anniversary of the entrance of Russian peacekeeping contingent into Nagorno-Karabakh, end quote. Why am I quoting this? Well, because I do not believe there is peace there to keep for now. The war hasn't really ended because at the border, there is still a lot of tension. There are people dying, being killed, and there are a lot of other questions with current day situation of whether Russian peacekeepers even are going to stay there any longer and what's going to happen with the Armenians there. But as you can see, the peacekeeper with the Kalashnikov over his shoulder is embracing this girl who is greeting him with a bouquet of flowers. And this image, this statue really resonates with the image of the Russian soldier with the child on horseback from 1916 newspaper. And they, first of all, of course, this is thought-provoking, but also they speak to use of image and symbols and the portrayal of so-called subjects versus objects of humanitarianism, right? It's like the savior, because the first one actually was the Excelsior described this soldier as the savior of Armenian people. And the second one, the statue is right in front of the wings. You see it almost like this angel who came to save the Armenian people. So yeah, but what the testimonies of refugees tell us are a bit different from this clear angel saving stories, as we notice. The Cossacks and Russian soldiers, for some Armenians, were just as violent and dangerous as Kurdish gangs. For others, they were saviors, the only way out of their misery. For some, Caucasus was safe haven, a shelter to recover and be fed in. For others, a hostile and unwelcoming place threatened by epidemics and imminent death. For many refugees, the exodus to the Caucasus was not a choice. It was a forced solution. They fled their homes to stay alive, but also to be able to return when given a chance and reconstruct their lives back, as they would write it in their testimonies, back in their fatherland. Little did these refugees know they were never going to return home. The majority of Armenians, hundreds of thousands of refugees struggling for their lives, as well as numerous of local villagers, paramedics, food station operators, transporters working tirelessly on behalf of those survivors, had no clear knowledge or understanding of all the political entanglements, complex relations between empires, relief workers, politicians. Yet, despite all these obstacles, certain disappointments, Armenian refugees, as well as the relief activists and even leadership, and in this case, I have here a quote from the religious leader of Armenians, Georg V. They saw improvement of the condition of Armenians only through the victory of the Allied powers. And more importantly, they hoped that Russian Empire would play a critical supporting role in this collective effort on behalf of Armenians. And I will end with this quote from the Catholicos of all Armenians, who said, "We're hopeful that with the kind assistance of Russian administrators and with Russian powerful patronage, the situation of our suffering sons will improve." I will stop here and I look forward to your questions.
What role did similar religious ties between the Russian Empire and Armenia, since they're mostly Christian as opposed to their Muslim neighbors, play in any altruistic efforts by the Russian imperial government to help out in Armenia?
As I told you yesterday, you ask really great questions. So, of course, also when probably you noticed from some of the quotes from refugees, a perception of Russia as a liberator. In some of those quotes, actually, we find Russian Empire described as their Christian liberator, because one of the major differences between those two empires, the borders of which they were crossing, was religion. And one of the major reasons that despite certain disappointments over ages, because Russia many times had promised Armenian leadership to help, assist, save them, and eventually not done it, still Armenians kept believing in Russia being the savior. In the same way, when we look into the policies of Russian military and civil authorities during this period towards the refugees, it really depended on religion in many cases. So, for instance, when the war started on the Caucasus front, the Russian imperial official policy was to remove any dangerous Muslim population from the front lines away. So Russian policy was seen really anti-Muslim. However, this was in the beginning only. By 1916, when Russia had become part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, with which all these powers had decided that as soon and when they win the war, they were going to divide all these conquered territories amongst themselves, and Russia was given Ottoman eastern provinces according to that promise. Russian authorities realized that, oh no, now we cannot do this because Eastern Ottoman Empire is going to be part of Russian Empire, and we need to become friends with the Kurdish population there. So after 1916, the policy shifts, and that's what we also see in the refugee testimonies. Because what happens at the beginning, it's all about attacking these territories, occupying these territories, and then suddenly we see that all this Kurdish population that by Armenians is blamed in attacks, in rape cases, in abductions, is being pardoned by Russian forces, because Russia doesn't want to create enemies inside its own territory, thinking that it is going to be its own territory. So religion mattered when it came to policy making at first, but as soon as it would come to decision making in terms of long-term plans for the state, religion would not take the first place, but the interests of the empire would be more important. And then Russia would become friends with anyone independent of their religious beliefs. There were some military leaders that still would not follow orders from the top, or would pretend that the order had not reached them yet, and continue policies against the Muslim population in those areas for some time. But eventually, of course, they would have to follow the imperial government's instructions. Yeah, thank you for the great question.
So thank you for a very rich lecture. During this week, we have kind of reflected on the uniqueness of the Holocaust, let's say, right? So that was a theme that came up in many of these lectures. But so here are the two questions. So is the Armenian genocide unique? And if so, in what way? If not, which of the other genocides are most like the Armenian genocide? If you give us a comparative analysis of the Armenian story, which story for genocide comes closest to the Armenian?
Thank you. I believe every genocide is unique because it happens to a certain group of people at certain time, different from the others, and it happens in its own way. So it's not about one, two cases, it's about all such horrible crises happening right now or in the past. All of them are unique in their own way. None of them is unprecedented or one of a kind when we think about studying it, understanding it, trying to explain to our students how these kind of horrible things happen, and what questions we need to pay attention to when learning or trying to comprehend these histories. So I believe, well, I teach a course on history of genocide, which takes a semester to reflect to second half of your question about which other cases are similar or different, to be able to put it in very short couple of sentences. I would say that one of the major similarities which we notice with my students when we discuss different cases of genocide is how pre-genocidal society, studying and understanding the society before genocide, is important to actually understand the genocide itself. Like I really appreciated the conversation about pre-modern anti-Semitism, because if you do not have understanding of how long back it goes, it would be really difficult to comprehend how that could have happened, how human beings could have done it. After all, we know that mostly the perpetration of genocide is conducted, especially on the ground, by ordinary people. So how do you mobilize people around such dehumanizing ideas within several months, or in some places a week or a day? It doesn't happen within a week, a day, or even several months. It's a long prehistory. So one of the major similarities is that. Another, I guess I'm being here picky because there are so many. I'll maybe talk about the gender aspect of genocides in general, and silence that follows sexual violence during every genocide that we can think of and try to learn about, study, examine. I think there is quite a similarity in that as well, because it doesn't matter whether it was the turn of the century, of the 20th century, or whether it happened in 21st century, whether it's the Armenian genocide or the genocide of Yazidis in Iraq. The shame, the stigma around rape, and hence this conspiracy of silence is still existent. It is there. It has changed a little bit, but if we look in the majority of cases, unfortunately, it's still there. The blaming of the victim or the fear that the victim will be blamed is there. And another thing I think about, if we just think about women's experiences during genocide, of course, is the lack of agency, which is sometimes really interesting, how in many of the cases, like, I don't know, we talk about Bangladesh, women in Bangladesh and in Armenian genocide, and look how during the genocide, they were deprived of agency of deciding where they were going to go. They were sold, they were raped, but also after the genocide, when they are impregnated and still not given a choice to decide whether they were going to keep those children or whether they were going to choose an abortion. So all these aspects are, and there are so many others. So, I mean, I could really go on, but I think it would not be that fair towards everyone else here. But thank you for the question.
Thank you for your outstanding presentation. We do have a question from an online viewer, and the end of your answer there, I think, is a perfect segue for this question. So Sarah Sewell asks, did female and male refugees view the Russians differently? Is it possible to offer a gender analysis to the testimonies?
Yes, that's a perfect fit.
Indeed.
Thank you. Yes, that is another important part of, first of all, paying attention to these testimonies, studying them in depth, which hasn't really been done. And I promise that I will also speak to that, why. So most of the Armenian language sources were neglected because they were considered to be not worthy of analysis, mostly since they might be considered biased. Because, as I said at the beginning, the major goal when the research on Armenian genocide studies began was to prove that it was genocide. And luckily now, it has changed. We do not think about it that way, and we have started, talking about refugee stories, reading Armenian language sources, and one of the really interesting aspects of doing it is to see how differently refugees testify and tell their stories dependent on whether they are female or male survivor. And this actually would be an interesting also connecting point to your other and the question about similarities, because a lot of course, research has been done on Holocaust testimonies, and some of the research by Kaplan and others and Lohr about distinctive differences between female and male stories and storytelling. And we see that actually quite in a similar way in Armenian genocide survivors' testimonies. For instance, not generalizing, but the majority of male testimonies would tell the stories of the village. How many cattle was lost, how many houses were taken by the enemy, what was the context, historical context of those developments, while a lot of the women testimonies would really be about family, their own feelings and experiences. And this was surprising to me initially, because for Armenian women coming from those traditional families in Ottoman Empire, it would have been terrifying to speak up about sexual violence, feelings that they had after that. But when the time came to actually tell their stories, and the reason I'm saying it was terrifying, because most of these people, the chroniclers that were asking the questions and interviewing, they were men. So these women had to tell their stories of survival to Armenian men. And that's all right. We're back. So it was surprising to me to see that they were still willing, like, you know, the story of Noyem, to tell that they were abducted, they were raped, that they feel like that we were abandoned, and share those stories. So I think that's one of the major aspects that we learn from female versus male testimonies in Armenian genocide. But of course, there are many others. It's just one example. Okay.
With the end of World War I and the really tumultuous happenings in the region, dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, Persian Empire, Russian Empire, and the whole new governments that sprang up in the whole communist revolution that go on soon, was there any opportunity in the decade following the genocide for Armenians to process or recover from the Armenian genocide in a meaningful way, publicly or privately?
Short answer is no. I mean, they found ways of remembering, of commemorating even, because there was even actually a commemoration already in 1919 organized by Armenians. But if we think about healing process, dealing with history, talking about it, it would be really problematic because, as yesterday also Paolo mentioned, Armenians did not have, in Republic of Armenia, which became part of Soviet Union, did not really have a chance to speak about the history that could be seen as nationalist approach to history by Soviet government. So throughout the Soviet period, from 1920 all the way to 1991, that was not genocide, was not something that people would talk about, write about, study. In 1965 and afterwards, there was a little bit of a change because, I mean, the changes in Soviet Union itself, the change of leadership and so on, hence a little bit more freedom, but it was Soviet freedom, which meant that there was a memorial, but there was no official genocide commemoration at that memorial. People somehow on April 24 every year would go to that memorial, but it was not officially seen as the Armenian genocide commemoration until the establishment of the Republic of Armenia in 1991, following which actually next to the Armenian Genocide Memorial, also a museum was created, which actually started telling the story and studying it. Most of the literature, history written about Armenian genocide came from the West. The scholarship was actually prospering in the United States. So the leading scholars actually like Richard Hovhannisyan, Vagan Dadrian, they were all based in United States or in France. But one of, I think, major issues about this healing and collectively feeling like there was some kind of understanding of it, it wasn't there mostly because the statehood, Armenian state, didn't have the chance to do it. And also there is this, that this state sort of could have served as some kind of a bridge connecting Armenians in Armenia with the diaspora, but there was also this disconnect between them. Since, you know, for so many years in the West, people were talking about it, looking into it, but then it almost, in the diaspora, there was this opinion about Armenians in Armenia that they were not interested in this topic. And then it would be explained, oh, they are not interested because these are Russian Armenians and they did not actually suffer from genocide. Well, I was born in Armenia and my grandfather was a survivor of genocide, but he did not become part of diaspora by leaving for the United States or moving to Lebanon or Syria. He was one of the children of those refugees that were crossing the border and coming to Russian Empire. But since the history of these people that today I was talking about wasn't really studied, it was widely seen like Armenians in Republic of Armenia had no connection with the history of genocide or this experience of genocide, while about 200,000 refugees came and stayed in that part and later became part of the newly created state. I don't know how much I responded to your question. Okay.
Can I maybe ask a question? Rape is of course a taboo topic, but there's often not really a silence around it. And the example that I want to give is, so after World War II, or many German women were raped by Russian soldiers at the end of World War II. And for a long time, scholarship has held, well, yeah, there was silence about this, and indeed, especially women who had to endure rape were pretty silent about it. But this doesn't mean that there wasn't a discourse about rape. It just morphed in from the individual story to a kind of a national story. So instead of women being raped, Germany was raped, right? Which is a kind of a form also of male dominance over this story of clearly what is female experience. But silence, it is not, right? Because the word rape, and clearly referring to the rape of women, just morphed into this kind of asexual space of the nation was violated. So I was wondering, is there any kind of similar story with respect to Armenia?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Volker. It's like from like rape of Belgium all the way to, right? There are these stories and the image of a woman as a mother, like you need to go to war to protect your sister and mother. The same way after a genocide or a war. In Armenian genocide case, actually, one of the nationalist plans of Armenians to survive collectively the genocide was the re-Armenization idea, which was that we need to bring all these abducted women, all these girls who were taken away from Armenian community back to their roots. And in those stories, rape of Armenian women impregnation, and their future children, they were seen as the nation's revenge against Turkey. So there were prominent Armenians who would organize meetings within the communities and talk about this, how important it was to treat these women as heroes who were going to bring more Armenians to the world and re-Armenize the population. Because, not long after the war was over, there was still this Paris Peace Conference and all the discussions about the territories that the newly established Republic of Armenia might get. Some of those Eastern Turkish territories might have become part of a larger Armenian state. And it was important to populate those areas with Armenians. So the women were seen as this army that was going to actually give birth to Armenian children. And as it's also exceptional to see that in some of those cases, even if those women were impregnated by the enemy and would be giving birth to children that would have Kurdish or Turkish fathers, or Bedouin fathers, for that matter, they would be still allowed to be seen as Armenian children, which is not how patriarchal society, an Armenian society was patriarchal, is patriarchal, worked. But there was the shift, and yes, they were seen as not individual cases, but more like a part of this nation's plan to take revenge and despite all the horrors to survive.
We have another question from the online viewers. Amanda asks, what role did the local religious institutions in Armenia play, if any, in the genocide?
What role local religious institutions in general played? That's a big question. Because I immediately went to thinking about like relief aspect of it, relief work. Is when we think about like all these refugees bringing, coming to Eastern Armenia or to Russian Empire, the Caucasus, major organizations that were assisting these refugees, that were giving them shelter, food. The first responders were churches and religious institutions. One of the committees that was helping Armenians was the Committee of Brotherly Aid, or Եղբայրական օգնության Committee, which was based in Echmiadzin, and that's the religious center of Armenians. That's where Catholicos is. So in terms of assistance, church and the religious institutions were quite important. But when it comes to discussing church's role or religious institutions' role in general during the genocide, that opens to a really huge topic about pre-genocide history of especially Ottoman Armenians, since Armenian leadership in Ottoman Empire pretty much was dependent on religious institutions. Millets were organized according to religious groups, Armenian millet, Greek millet. They were led by the religious leader. But because even though those millets were given some kind of autonomy in internal affairs of Armenians, respectively also Greeks and Assyrians, those leaders also had to be really cautious in what kind of rhetoric would be welcome among Armenians living in Ottoman Empire. For instance, Armenians by their religious leaders in Ottoman Empire would be advised not to, rebel, not to complain about certain injustices that were happening continuously for hundreds of years. So there was this part of religious leadership which sort of was trying to keep Armenians loyal to the state, fearing that if that didn't happen, something really terrible like genocide could happen. But at the same time, if we're looking into the aspect of practical assistance and help for refugees during and after the genocide, those institutions also were among the central ones helping and saving lives.
All right. I think thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and following all our questions.